February 2nd, 1953, an airliner belonging to Skyways of London would depart the Azores for Newfoundland. As the aircraft neared Newfoundland, it would make a quick series of communications that would indicate some sort of emergency. What sort of emergency the aircraft encountered is unknown, as over 70 years later, these messages are the only significant evidence of what happened to this aircraft and its 39 occupants. No confirmed trace of the aircraft has ever been found. This mystery has faded into obscurity in the many years since, but today I'm going to take a look at this forgotten mystery. World War II had ended less than a decade prior, and its effects were still felt around the world. Dwight Eisenhower, commander of Allied forces in Europe during the war, had been elected the 34th President of the United States the previous November, and was sworn in a couple weeks prior on January 20th. Around noon on February 2nd, he would deliver his first State of the Union address to the nation. The Korean War was still raging across the Pacific, and U.S. forces were highly active in the fight to keep communism out of South Korea. To the north, things were much quieter in Canada. Prime Minister Louis St. Laurent and his Liberal Party would soon face an easy re-election in August of that year. On that day, the Houses of Parliament in Ottawa were not discussing the current events in Canada, but instead were primarily concerned with the events going on in Europe. Across the Atlantic, in the United Kingdom, things were far from quiet. Winston Churchill had returned to the office of Prime Minister back in 1951. King George VI had passed away on the 6th of February 1952, leading to the ascension of Queen Elizabeth II to the throne. She would soon mark her first year as Queen. This upcoming anniversary was not the primary concern for Queen Elizabeth, Churchill, or anyone else in the UK, though. Starting on the 31st of January, a major storm had struck the UK and the Low Countries. Massive flooding ensued that devastated vast swaths of land in the affected nations. The Netherlands were hardest hit, with at least 1,800 people killed. The UK was hard hit as well, with over 300 being killed and widespread flooding damaging much of eastern England. On the seas, the storm would claim more victims as numerous vessels were sunk. Among them, the British ferry Princess Victoria, which had been attempting a journey from Scotland to Northern Ireland on the 31st. The massive waves whipped up by the storm would bash in the car deck doors as the ferry tried to return to safety. The ship would take on water and eventually capsize, with only 44 of an estimated 177 on board surviving. Among the dead were the Deputy Prime Minister of Northern Ireland and a Member of Parliament. Eisenhower, Churchill, and the F-51s soaring over Korea weren't the only traces of the Second World War still contributing to the post-war world. And soon, the North Sea flood wouldn't be the only disaster unfolding. A bit past 5 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, on the 2nd, a lone airliner slowly but steadily made its way across the Atlantic. Its destination was the town of Gander, from which it would continue on towards Jamaica. The concept of the Avro York came into being in 1941 at the height of World War II. Roy Chadwick, the chief designer at Avro and best remembered for creating the Avro Lancaster, saw a need for a large transport both during the war and after it. Despite a shortage of such aircraft, there had been little interest in creating one due to a lack of materials. Nevertheless, Chadwick proceeded to create the drawings for this new aircraft and submitted them to Avro's experimental department in February of 1942. This new aircraft was a high-wing monoplane of metal construction. Chadwick elected to reuse the wings, landing gear, and tail assemblies from his Lancaster, which by this point was already in service with the RAF. This included reusing the 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines from the aircraft. The fuselage was where the major changes were made. The plane had a tall, boxy fuselage and, depending on the type, a large set of cargo doors on the left side of the aircraft. The result was a distinctive, if not attractive, aircraft that would prove highly valuable to the British war effort. The first prototype for the Avro York took off from RAF Ringway near Manchester on July 5, 1942. Further testing would occur at RAF Boscombe Down near Salisbury and Stonehead. This would result in an order for 3 more prototypes and a production batch. Due to a lack of interest and resource shortages exacerbated by the plane using many of the same materials as the far more important Lancaster, production would initially be quite slow. By the end of 1943, only the 4 prototypes and 3 production aircraft had been finished. The third prototype would be named Ascalon and would serve as a personal transport for Winston Churchill and King George VI. It would carry Churchill to several important conferences during its service. Though the aircraft was originally intended for transport, the 4th prototype was used to test combat uses for the type. This aircraft was completed as a paratroop transport. During testing at Ringway, however, it was found that parachutes would frequently get caught in the tail wheel, and the scheme was quickly abandoned. The aircraft would at first only see use as a VIP transport. Field Marshal Jan Smuts, Prime Minister of South Africa, General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French Forces and future French President, and the Duke of Gloucester, Governor-General of Australia, would be among the major figures to be assigned to their own Yorks. Several other Yorks would be shared amongst British cabinet ministers and military leaders. Production would pick up in 1944. Models designed for passenger, cargo, or a combination of both were manufactured. The original order by the RAF called for 300 Yorks. However, only 208 were completed by the time the final RAF York left the factory in April of 1948. These would not be the only Yorks built, however. It was not expected that the York would have much of a life beyond the war, as suggested by Avro itself, describing it as a wartime and immediate post-war symbol of things to come. This appraisal was not necessarily incorrect, as most Yorks were withdrawn from service within a decade of the war's end, though a few would remain in service until the mid-1960s. One of the first non-military organizations to show interest in the York was the British Overseas Airways Corporation, or BOAC, a British state-owned airline. BOAC would have 5 Yorks destined for the RAF diverted for their own uses in February of 1944. They were originally used to provide service between the UK and Cairo starting on April 22, 1944. Later, a further 25 were built specifically for BOAC, providing service to British India and various British colonies in eastern and southern Africa. South African Airways would briefly lease 9 Yorks from BOAC from January 1946 to September 1947, as they waited for delivery of DC-4s. Many other airlines felt similarly to South African Airways, preferring American designs like the Douglas DC-4 and Lockheed Constellation. Few operators outside of the British Empire were interested in the design. One exception was FAMA, a state-owned airline from Argentina that purchased 5. 12 more were purchased by British South American Airways, a British state-owned airline serving South America as well as British colonies in West Africa and the Caribbean. Numerous private operators would buy up retired RAF and corporate examples. New York's finest hour came in 1948. In June of that year, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, and aircraft were used by the Western powers to break said blockade.
Hundreds of planes of all types and sizes, military and civil, were pressed into service. The RAF York, load 9 tons.
The RAF contributed the bulk of their Yorks to the Berlin airlift, eventually assisting with a Soviet defeat. They would carry a total of 230,000 tons of supplies across a total of 29,000 flights, being the most important part of the British contribution to the airlift. It did not come without cost to the Yorks, however. At least 9 Yorks were destroyed during the airlift, killing a total of 8 people. Worth for the Yorks would come in the aftermath of the airlift. The aircraft had been worked to their limits to keep Stalin out of West Berlin, and for many it had been too much. Many had suffered serious corrosion damage during the airlift due to the cargo carried on board. Most remaining RAF Yorks were retired, with many being broken up shortly afterwards. Around 40 survived and were offered for sale to private operators. BOAC ended passenger service with the York in October of 1950. A few would be kept for freight service, but most would be sold to private operators, and from this point on, York service would almost entirely be performed by private operators. They would see extensive use amongst companies in the UK, Canadian North, and the Middle East until the final active York, Golf Alpha November Tango Kilo of Gander, London, would be retired in 1964. Besides the 4 prototypes and the 208 aircraft made for the RAF, 25 were built for BOAC, 12 for BSAA, 3 for Skyways Limited, 5 for FAMA, and a single example for the RCAF built in Canada, for a total of 258. Only 2 Yorks have been preserved. The previously mentioned Golf Alpha November Tango Kilo, originally built for the RAF and registered Mike Whiskey 232, was a veteran of the Berlin airlift. Sold to Dan Air in 1954, it would serve until 1964, when it was donated to the Air Scouts. It is currently on display at the Imperial War Museum Duxford near Cambridge in the UK. Secondly, Golf Alpha Golf November Victor, one of the Yorks built for BOAC, originally named Moville, later Middlesex, appears to have been one of the few aircraft kept for freight work by the corporation. It was sold to Skyways in 1955 and would be retired in 1964. It would at first be renovated to serve as a replica of Ascalon, the transport for Churchill, which had been scrapped in the 1950s. Today, it has been repainted as a replica of an RAF York, currently residing at the RAF Museum at Cosford, near Birmingham. These aircraft would contribute in their own way to recreating the primary subject of this video. It's finally time to discuss the aircraft that went missing near Newfoundland 70 years ago. The subject of this video is Golf Alpha Hotel Foxtrot Alpha. For the sake of simplicity, we will refer to it as Foxtrot Alpha. Foxtrot Alpha was the 5th of 12 Yorks built for British South American Airways, or BSAA. It was built sometime in 1946 and was delivered to BSAA in August of that year. The Avro 685 York was a 4-engine, high-wing, all-metal monoplane. This aircraft had a wingspan of 102 feet, a fuselage length of 78 feet 6 inches, an empty weight of 41,000 pounds, and a maximum weight of 65,000 pounds. I created the model shown here to assist me in explaining certain aspects of this case, and so I could become more familiar with Foxtrot Alpha myself. I used plans found in the aircraft manuals and various references freely available on the internet to create a complete 1:72 scale Avro York. This model took about 80 hours to create in SketchUp, and many more hours spent 3D printing, painting, and assembling the model. This was the first large model that I've created, and I've painted it as I believe it would have appeared during its final flight. One of the York's most distinctive features is its triple tail. The 2 outer tailplanes have a total span of 33 feet and were copied from the Avro Lancaster. Originally, the York was only intended to have these 2 fins, however, stability issues were revealed during the prototype stage, and all production Yorks would receive a 3rd central fin to resolve this issue. The York features a tall, boxy fuselage. The purpose of this was likely to increase the amount of space within the aircraft. Very little reference info was available for the interior of the aircraft, and the solid info I was able to find depicted aircraft set up differently than Foxtrot Alpha. One of the areas I do have a decent amount of confidence in is the rear of the fuselage. In Yorks built for passenger service, like Foxtrot Alpha, the rear of the fuselage is used as the baggage hold. The very rear of the baggage compartment contains emergency equipment, such as inflatable dinghies and their equipment, crash axes, fire extinguishers, and a desert survival kit. In the case of Foxtrot Alpha, the plane was fitted with 6 dinghies, life belts, pyrotechnic signals, and a single emergency radio. This compartment can be accessed through a small square door on the left side of the fuselage, or through the galley. The galley was located between the baggage compartment and the passenger compartment. The galley is fitted with all the necessary equipment to enable the lone stewardess to prepare meals for all on board. Most of the fuselage is taken up by the passenger compartment. This part of the aircraft is the one that I am not entirely sure about. The model shown here is based on one of the earlier Yorks. This version has 2 passenger areas split in half by the lavatories and cloakroom. This version only has a capacity of 27 passengers, while Foxtrot Alpha's configuration had a capacity of at least 34 passengers. I was unable to find any specifics on the configuration used on this aircraft. The only thing I found that suggested how the aircraft may have been configured was a mention in the Wikipedia page for Skyways, stating that some of their aircraft were modified to have 36 rear-facing seats. Looking at my model, I think this is a believable explanation, as the rear-facing seats would allow for increased capacity. However, I'm not sure whether this would allow enough space for 3 more rows of seats to be fitted, without changing the location of or otherwise modifying the lavatories. Perhaps removing one, I'm not sure, though ultimately the seating arrangement is likely irrelevant to the case being discussed. One part of the passenger cabin that is relevant are the escape hatches. The York was equipped with a pair of escape hatches in the roof of the aircraft. These could be accessed using a retractable ladder fitted to the ceiling. The York's high-wing design would have made escape in case of a ditching difficult, if not impossible, without the use of these hatches. The wings. The York's wings and undercarriage were also copied from the Lancaster. The undercarriage consists of a fixed rear tail wheel and a pair of retractable main gear wheels. Each wing contains 3 fuel tanks, numbered 1 through 3, with number 1 being closest to the fuselage and number 3 being the furthest. In addition to this, a 7th tank is located in the upper fuselage between the wings. The maximum fuel capacity is 2,478 gallons. The number 1 and 2 tanks provide fuel directly to the engines, while the number 3 tanks provide additional fuel for each wing's respective number 2 tank, and the center tank provides fuel for the number 1 tanks. Fuel is distributed via a system of pipes, valves, and pumps. The center tank is the only one fitted with a self-sealing coating, and no method of jettisoning fuel in flight was provided. Standard procedure for fuel tank usage would be to initially use the number 2 tanks until they drop below 180 gallons. The crew would then switch to the number 1 tanks and to empty the number 3 tanks into the number 2 tanks. The number 1 tanks would be used until they drop below 180 gallons. The number 2 tanks are then switched back to, and the number 1 tanks are filled using the center wing tank. The number 2 tanks are then used until they are empty, and the rest of the flight will be flown on the number 1 tanks. In turbulent conditions, the aircraft is easier to control if the number 2 and 3 tanks are empty. Pilots are advised to use the number 3 tanks as quickly as possible. These tanks are only connected to the rest of the system by a single pump. If this pump were to fail, fuel from the respective tank would become unusable. The fuel is fed into 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin 502 engines. This was a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine that saw extensive use during the war. Variants of the Merlin were used in the Supermarine Spitfire, Hawker Hurricane, de Havilland Mosquito, and P-51 Mustang. It was also used by the Avro Lancaster and was thus copied to the York. These engines could each provide 1,030 horsepower. In addition to fuel, they also required water to be loaded on board the aircraft for cooling. The York could remain in the air if 2 engines were lost, provided certain procedures were followed, including the feathering of propellers. 3-bladed propellers were fitted to the engines. If the engines failed, these could be feathered to reduce drag. If they could not be feathered, this could seriously affect the aircraft's ability to remain in the air. Besides providing thrust, each engine powered its own 1,500-watt generator and charged the aircraft's batteries. If the outboard engines were lost, only their generators would be lost, but if the inboard engines were lost, this would affect the vacuum pumps, air compressors, and hydraulic systems. All engines and the center fuel tank were fitted with fire extinguishing systems. There was no method of transferring the contents of the fire bottles between engines. This meant that if an aircraft fire extinguisher failed to extinguish a fire, there was nothing more that could be done to put it out. Handheld fire extinguishers were also provided for emergencies inside the cabin. Some Yorks were fitted with a wing-mounted dinghy that could be quickly launched using a release located in the cabin. Foxtrot Alpha does not appear to have been fitted with this feature. The York appears to have not been pressurized and therefore could not fly above 10,000 feet without supplemental oxygen being provided to the passengers and crew. Oxygen bottles could be stowed in the rear of the aircraft. The cockpit has 4 crew positions. The captain sits in the left-hand seat, and the first officer sits in the right-hand seat, as is common on modern aircraft. The York would be controlled using a series of cables, pulleys, and rods. Simple autopilot was also available to the crew to assist with flying the aircraft. The cockpit appears to have been typical for an aircraft of this era. Under the first officer is the navigator's station. For long flights, especially over water, a navigator would be needed to keep the plane on track. A side blister window and astrodome are provided so the navigator can determine the aircraft's position using celestial navigation. Lastly, behind the captain's seat is the radio operator's station. I was unable to find much info on the radio equipment used on the York specifically, but looking at the available info for other Avro airliners that appear to have been using similar or the same equipment, we could make an educated guess. The radio operator would have access to 2 methods of communication: wireless telephony and wireless telegraphy. Wireless telephony would involve the radio operator directly speaking to controllers on the ground, similar to how aircraft of the modern era communicate. Wireless telegraphy is a much older system of communicating that requires the use of Morse code. This is a system that has long since fell out of favor as a method of communication for aircraft and everywhere else. The reason telegraphy equipment was carried on board Foxtrot Alpha was due to a flaw with the early telephony equipment used on board the aircraft. The telephony equipment had a much shorter range, with a description of similar equipment on another Avro airliner, giving a range of 200 miles. In contrast, the telegraphy system had a range measured in the thousands of miles. During flights over land with well-developed radio infrastructure, the telephony system could be used reliably. During longer flights with little infrastructure, such as a transoceanic flight, telegraphy would have to be used. Multiple transmitters and receivers of both types were likely available to the radio operator. These could also be used to locate navigational beacons and use beam approach systems, though these are of no relevance to the current case. As previously mentioned, Foxtrot Alpha was the 5th of 12 Yorks built for British South American Airways, or BSAA. It was built sometime in 1946 and was delivered to BSAA in August of that year. BSAA would name Foxtrot Alpha Star Dale. One of Foxtrot Alpha's sisters, Golf Alpha Hotel Echo Whiskey, had made history on June 11, 1946, when it made a flight between Venezuela and the UK via Bermuda and Gander. It was the first commercial aircraft to fly directly between Gander and London, accomplishing this feat in 10 hours and 35 minutes with a full load of passengers and crew. Foxtrot Alpha would spend the next 3 years serving BSAA uneventfully. The airline would be merged into BOAC in 1949 for reasons best left to another video or series, perhaps. Foxtrot Alpha was one of 9 surviving BSAA Yorks that would join BOAC. At this point, however, BOAC was looking to retire their fleet of Yorks and would sell most of them to the Lancashire Aircraft Corporation, or LAC. Foxtrot Alpha would be transferred to LAC in December of 1951, and it would remain with LAC until its disappearance. The plane would be given to Skyways of London, a subsidiary of LAC. Skyways was founded by Alfred Critchley, who had played a key role in training pilots for the Royal Flying Corps during World War I and the RAF during World War II. Critchley was asked to take over control of BOAC in 1943, as well as assisting with the planning of what would eventually become London Heathrow Airport. He would become dissatisfied with the British government's plans for the civil aviation industry after the war and would resign as its general director in 1946. He would work alongside British aviation pioneer Sir Alan Cobham to form a new company. Skyways Limited was an independent charter airline formed in 1946 based on a previous company founded in 1929 of the same name. It was the only independent company to order Yorks, all others being for militaries or state-owned airlines. Skyways would also obtain the sole Canadian-built York. Most of the company's original flights served British oil industry operations in the Middle East, various European cargo operations, as well as providing shorter flights between tourist destinations in Europe. It had attempted to begin providing services to the Far East, including a service between London and Karachi, which would compete directly with BOAC. However, this was thwarted by political pressures favoring the state-owned BOAC. Skyways' most significant operations would occur during the Berlin airlift, as 7 of their aircraft would fly fuel and cargo to West Berlin between November 1948 and August 1949. Skyways had grown to become the largest charter airline in Europe, though the company's luck would run out shortly afterwards. The company had apparently struggled to find enough business after the airlift. The end would come in 1950 as the UK economy went downhill and the company was forced to liquidate in March of that year. Skyways attempted to restart but would cease operations in January of 1952. In March of 1952, the company was acquired by LAC. The Lancashire Aircraft Corporation was founded in 1942, performing repairs on RAF aircraft. After the war, the company moved into the air charter business. It would also participate in the Berlin airlift. Between 1951 and 1952, LAC would purchase most of BOAC's fleet of Avro Yorks to replace their own fleet of modified Handley Page Halifaxes. That year, it would also purchase Skyways Limited. The company would become a subsidiary of LAC called Skyways of London, based at London Stansted Airport. Foxtrot Alpha would continue to serve Skyways of London until its demise. In the next part of the series, we will be discussing the circumstances around the final flight of Foxtrot Alpha and the subsequent search. Stay tuned, and I'll have that up as soon as I can.